Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Good morning to and welcome to the Literary Translation Centre of Day 2 of London Book Fair. Can't quite believe there are so many still standing and sitting at this point already. Very impressed. My name is Chris Gribble. I'm the Chief Exec at Writers' Centre Norwich, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this morning for our panel, which it should be translation as activism rather than translator as activism. It's definitely not London Book Fair as copy editor. We've tried to get it changed, but never mind. We're here to talk about translation and activism, from politics to cultural change and the different ways that translators and translation are changing the world with their works. I suppose our discussion, and we hope it will be a discussion both with the panel and the audience, is about the wider cultural and social and political impacts that translation and translators have in the world of literature and beyond. What are the wider results of the work of literary translators in our worlds? How can and do literary translators add to the social and political dialogues about the countries and the territories from their works, where their works are coming from, but also the territories in which their works are directed? How are the worlds of publishing, literary translation, and freedom of expression working together? And which ways can they better work together, perhaps? What roles does literary translation play in the global struggle for human rights, equality, and diversity? And how, perhaps, can we use literary translation as a process or as a model or method in developing community understanding and change? It's a real pleasure to welcome two panelists today to talk with us. The first is Kadija George, who is a literary activist, a short story writer, a poet of Sierra Leonean descent. She is a graduate of Birmingham University and worked first as the coordinator of the Centerprise Literature Development Project, which is one of the very early days of the literature development sector, and she left there to set up and become the publisher and managing editor of Sable Lit Mag. She's the coordinator of People Tree Press's writer development program in Scribe, and she recently launched a new app, the Pan-Africanist's Modern Journey, which I really recommend you have a look at on your smartphones or pads. She's edited numerous volumes of short stories, including IC3, the Penguin Book of New Black Writing with Courtier Newland in 2000, and her most recent collection of critical writings, which is Erki?
Yes, that's poetry collection.
Poetry, was published in 2013. And she's also, in addition to everything else, General Secretary for the African Writers Abroad group. Next to Kadija is Erica Jarnes, who joined English Pen in February 2015. She had previously worked as an editor at Bloomsbury Publishing. She'd worked as a literary events programmer at the South Bank Centre and book campaigns director at the Pigeonhole. At English Pen, she manages the Writers and Translation Programme, which champions the best literature from around the world through publisher grants, weekly blog of international writing, year-round public events, and professional development seminars and workshops and collaborative projects. So I'd like to welcome them both this morning. And I'm going to start by asking Erica to talk a little bit about the range of work that Pen does and the growing function of literary translation within the Pen and freedom of expression movement. Erica.
Thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear me? Good. It's really nice to have this opportunity to talk about translators and how translators are involved with all of the work that English Pen does. I'll quickly introduce the organisation in case some of you don't know all of the different things that we do. We're a writers' organisation. We were established in 1921 by a group of writers, and I just found out on Wikipedia yesterday that is 1 year after the word activism was coined. Maybe there's a connection. It was set up by writers in order that they could campaign for other writers. And this idea of writers being in solidarity with other writers supporting each other, is really at the heart of what English Pen does even now, when we're a professional charity and most of the staff and our members and supporters don't necessarily identify as professional writers anymore. Translators, of course, are writers. They've always been writers and are really key to a lot of the different work that we do. I want to talk about translation and activism, and also translation as activism, because we sort of engage with both of those ideas at Pen. On the kind of and side, most of you might know English Pen through our campaigns on behalf of individual writers around the world who are at risk because of what they want to write. at risk from the law or from violence. And translators are really important in quite a lot of our campaigns on behalf of those writers, especially where those writers don't write in English. I'll give you a couple of examples. When the Cameroonian poet activist Enomé Messe, who writes in French, was in prison, he wrote a collection of poems which a group of translators volunteered to translate into English so that English Pen could publish that anthology and raise awareness about his case. I'm not necessarily suggesting that the anthology directly led to his release. He was released last year, but he said when he came out that knowing that his poems were out there, outside prison and also outside Cameroon, really helped him to feel less alone and to feel supported while he was in prison. And that's a really powerful thing that translators help to do. Translators have also helped us to urgently translate articles by journalists, for example, in Mexico and Turkey, reporting on really live freedom of expression issues from those countries. They've had to work very quickly sometimes. We've just recently, with Free Word and Article 19, published a report by the Turkish journalist Ahmet Şık, who's currently in the UK for his own safety. And that was a fascinating, really important new report about freedom of expression in Turkey, and was translated at great speed. And so translators can help in those areas too. We also have an outreach program called Readers and Writers, and translators have featured as writer facilitators working with young people and groups of migrants, refugees who are often multilingual and maybe are exploring the creative possibilities of that with their own expression. On the translation as activism side, we're at a big trade fair, an English Pen. Most of the people here probably know English Pen's translation program, which I run. We work with the publishing industry to champion more international writers, more writers from other languages being made available in English. So that sounds like a cultural activity. It's good to get more books from elsewhere available to English language readers, but it's actually really politically significant as well because of the role that English occupies globally as a language of power, language of global business and finance and decision-making at the highest level. And it matters that voices and stories from other places are made available into English. And I just want to say that I think translators do something really magical because not only are, in the act of literary translation, are stories from other places being made available in the Anglophone world, the voices themselves are also being made available because translators do something very special that foreign correspondents, for example, can't do. They transmit actual voices between languages. Jenny Erpenbeck, who is the German writer who won the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize last year with her translator Susan Banowski for The End of Days, and she's just been shortlisted for the Impact as well, which is great news. Her book was supported by 2 Pen grants before publication, and she said in her acceptance speech for the prize that when she read her English edition, she was reading her book but Susan Banowski's words, and that is a lovely thing to say, but it also really captures what translators do. It's about having real, authentic voices from other perspectives into English, which is a really, really important act, and I think it's an activist act as well. So that's why it matters to us that we're engaged with that kind of tectonic plate cultural change thing, as well as the sort of direct action, urgent work which translators also help us with.
Thank you very much, Erica. It was a really interesting start to think about the English language as a space for activism in translation as well as publishing. Perhaps if we can ask Kadija now to say something about your work and the different perspectives that you have on translation as activism.
Good morning, everybody. Well, I always think, for me, translation of the African languages has always been important because as a Sierra Leonean brought up here, living in a family household that was multilingual but not being allowed to speak those languages was really kind of frustrating, and it's frustrating for a lot of African children brought up here, because when their parents migrate, they don't always want them to speak their own language. It's like speak English so that you can be you'll get on better in England without speaking your home languages. And I think now at least parents are realizing that's the wrong way to go. So that's all happening. So what I try to do, for example, in my poetry collection was I did have some work in Creole, because that's one of the typical language we speak is in Creole. So I had one poem that was in Creole first, for example, then in English, so that the Creole came first before the English. But I also really like, and I always encourage people I'm working with to mix the languages they have. I said there is not a problem, mixing languages in one poem, and you've got something very real and something very different in that. And some of the poets I'm working with in the Gambia, for example, they'll be speaking 3 or 4 languages, and Gambia is this tiny country which is Anglophone, but surrounded by French-speaking ones. So they speak French as well. So for somebody who is supposedly illiterate, they will speak English, French, and probably 2 African languages. So I'm just encouraging them to perform, or if they can to write in all of those languages. So now we're getting some great rap stuff coming out, and they are just every few lines is a different language, and I'm just standing there going, huh. But you understand it all as well. That's the lovely thing. You can still understand it all, and that's really great. So I'm working, as I said, with a lot of people in West Africa, which is wonderful, and I've been working with Kwame Dawes from the States, who's got the African Poetry Book Fund, and they've placed 5 poetry libraries in Africa, in Anglophone countries. But I know they want to kind of expand and change that, and I think it's Anglophone countries because also a lot of the competitions that they're starting with the base of, American English, which is another language in itself. But even the books that they send to the library, so for the first, we set up the library just over a year ago. So we get about 300 books. Most of them are in English, but they do send work in translation as well. And I'm just getting young people involved to help us, stack the books and everything. And they're coming up with their own ideas and suggestions, like, okay, why don't we have a section with just African poets and sections just with African language poets? And we're going back to the African Poetry Book Fund saying, can you help us with this? This is what these young people want. And one of the other things I'm going to be doing is I am organising a festival with some people next year in January, and at least the tourism department are helping, and they've said, well, okay, whichever visitors can come, visiting poets can come, what we will do is we will translate their work into the 3 main languages. I think they've got about 10 languages, 3 languages in the Gambia, so that work can go out. So it will be in a written form, but it will also be audio. So we are going to archive that, but at least that just means to say we can get that work out there in different languages, in different African languages. So I am as well a member of the African Literature Association, which is based in the States. And one translator who's very well known, she's one here, Wangui Wagoro, she did set up one of the committees as part of the African Literature Association as a translation one, because they're very much into not just translating African languages into English and vice versa, but translating African languages into other African languages. That is a big push for us right now, especially with writers well known like Ngugi wa Thiong'o. That's one of his big loves. So even though we were hoping he was going to get the Nobel Prize last year, didn't get it, he was very happy because a major prize was set up. A Kiswahili translation prize was set up, which is encouraging African languages to be translated into Africa. And that is a lifetime kind of thing for him. And when I met him just a couple of weeks ago in Los Angeles, and we did a panel, because nearly all of his children are now also writers. So we had a panel of the whole Ngugi family all being writers. And he said that he had sent one of his short stories, and he doesn't write many short stories, to a new journal run by young people in Kenya. And he said, this 10-page story has done something that all of my writing and all of my publishing my novels in years has not been able to do. And within a few months, this one short story has been translated into about 30 different African languages. And now they're getting requests from, he said, Brazil and India to have it translated as well. So he said that's done some of that translation work, that crossing borders, crossing boundaries that he's always wanted to do and that he's always been advocating for. And he said, and it took one short story. You know, so it's just all of those things are just kind of really exciting that are bubbling and happening.
And could you thank you. Could you perhaps say something a little bit about publishing work in the UK that you've been involved in? Because while it isn't necessarily directly translation focused, it is around cultural translation and cultural boundary breaking.
It is. I mean, well, part of it is in translation in terms of I have a literary magazine called Sable, which is, yes, and which has got the latest one there. And what we do is we do have a section called In Translation, so that we have a writer, not always African, but a writer of colour, give us work in the language it was written in, and then have an English translation afterwards. Unfortunately, because we don't really have any money producing the magazine, we don't have a lot of money for translators, and we really rely on whoever's written the poem to give us the English translation as well. But it's been really interesting that we've had really a lot of languages that are not, known very much. So we had a translation like, it was like one in England and Shetland dialect, because there is an Asian poet and that's where she lived. We've got one with Kiswahili, and we have Somali. Somali is great because Somali poets are just like, it's wonderful area, Somali poetry, and it's almost like songs, and it's a great, in the UK even, the Somali poetry is a big scene. When, they know that their poets are going to be somewhere and performing and writing, there'll be a couple of hundred people there easily, So when I published a book with People Tree Press a few years ago called Red, which was of Black British poets, the first poet in there, in fact, was a Somali poet, and we had it in Somali and English. And people just loved it. And he said, well, that encourages young Somalians here to realize that they are part of the British society, but it doesn't mean to say they have to let go of their culture and their language. And it was really good having that as the first poem, because it kind of had a statement. I mean, it was in alphabetical order, so we didn't kind of do it just for that reason. So so that's the other kind of work I do.
Thank you. I think Erica, if I can come back to you, I think when you talked about PEN and it's starting up as an organisation for writers to help writers, and I just wondered, from things that you've both said, are we now at a point where every time we say writer, we also mean literary translator as well? Do we hold literary translators on an absolutely equal par with writers in this process? And
yes, translators are writers. Our president, Maureen Freely, was on one of the panels here at the LTC yesterday and emphatically made that point throughout their hour discussion. Translators are writers. Translators are artists. You're not technicians providing a service to the publishing industry. You create works, and that's absolutely, translators are writers. But also in the last 100 years since PEN was set up, the definition of writer has expanded to include journalists, bloggers. Obviously, the whole internet didn't exist in 1921, and there's lots of new forms and of writing. But also because of social media and issues around libel and what laws around what you can say online, the things that affect writers in a way affect everybody now in a way that they maybe weren't considered to in the 1920s.
Yeah, and in terms of the connections that literary translators have with each other through PEN, are there similar translation programs in other PEN centres around the world?
So the different PEN centres, there's about 145 now around the world, and they all have different priorities. They don't all follow the same model in any way, and that makes sense because there are different issues affecting writers in different countries. PEN American Centre has quite a big translation program, but they also live in the English language, and so they're dealing with a lot of the same sort of historic and political issues. There are smaller PEN centres like PEN Occitan in France, whose main work is to champion Occitan as a language within France that is taken seriously within literary life in France. And that is something so far away from what we're experiencing in the UK with English being such a dominant language. So it's really different in every centre. But in every centre, the work is about the issues that affect writers in that country or working in that cultural context.
Yeah, and coming on to that subject of the English language and your comment about translating from African to African languages, I know that Writer Centre with Kate Griffin, who's somewhere around, she's right there.
Hiding.
Blowing her nose. Kate has been working with partners in Myanmar and looking at translating between the languages in that region rather than sometimes using English as a bridge language, but sometimes avoiding English entirely and translating between languages. How does it feel to sit in London Book Fair in the heart of the English language publishing world, thinking about literary translations activism with the globe's largest, most dominant language at our fingertips? How do you deal with that on both an institutional and a personal basis? Kadija.
Oh, thank goodness it's happening. It has to happen. And I remember one time, I can't remember when this was, it was a few years ago, and I was having a conversation with somebody about Gabriel Garcia Marquez's work, and people kind of say, well, we forget that when we're reading it, we're reading a work in translation at the end of the day, and it's not it wasn't in English. So it's, even though English is a dominant language in many countries, we have to kind of almost see that as mainly as a bridge and not as, again, that we're always translating into English. But of course, the fact that people who speak English who want to read a lot more work that's coming from different places, I'm finding that more and more people are kind of saying, oh, let's see what we can get translation-wise from African languages into English for more people to read. I'm going to hopefully be doing the same thing like with Comma Press, with a book with the African language, and they're doing some amazing work as well in terms of fiction work. So it's happening. I mean, it's a good thing that people are not seeing it as something that is distant from them, that is not something that's kind of intellectual. And then some of the translators are really giving, which is nice. I remember when I was involved with Poetry Parnassus at South Bank, and I did Word from Africa at the end, and some of the poets, they only spoke in their mother tongue, or it might have been French. So I had some poets from the UK, from the diaspora, they would acknowledge the translator on stage, but then they would read with the poet. So one would read in English and one would read in their own language. That kind of thing is happening more and more. Yeah. Which I think is great, which is fun.
Is that about developing a community around the translator and the writer?
Yes, I think that is really important. Because obviously the translator, when they're translating a work, it's like their work as well, and is very close to them. But as well, in terms of the way they're sharing it, is also really important as well, to let other people have like on the ground access to that. I think
and the audiences as well,
absolutely.
I suppose, in that.
Yeah. And as well, sometimes the language, you're not always going to, of course, understand it literally, but you understand it from the sense, from the rhythm. So I love things like Somali poetry. It's just wonderful listening to it. And I was thinking as I was walking up here, I've got this on my iTunes thing somewhere, the Messiah sung in Zulu. I don't think I've ever listened to the Messiah sung any other way, and it's so powerful. Yeah. It's so powerful. So that's exciting.
Erica, English, and the dominance of English, how is that something that sits both in campaigning terms and in artistic terms within the translation programme at Penn?
I'm really struck by what Kadija's saying about solidarity between writers from other languages into other languages. It's not all about everybody standing in a big circle looking into English as the centre. It's not an aspirational thing. It's just the way that the world is at the moment does have English in this particular position of power. So it kind of depends on what we're trying to achieve, really. I think that, well, as I was saying before, it comes down to solidarity between writers and a sense of feeling like you're part of a community, feeling like you're part of a movement. And that can be about deciding what your voice is and sticking with your language and working out what it is you want to say, where you're coming from. But it could also be then getting that message across to as big an audience as possible. And so because we're in the London Book Fair, thought I should talk about the publishing grants that we have as well. We've supported over 200 books from other languages getting into English, but that means often the writers who are translated tend to be big established literary figures in their own countries. They're not marginal. They're the people who've won big prizes and sold lots of copies in their own countries. That's why they're often the candidates for being translated. So in terms of kind of activism and getting outside voices heard, that's kind of like level one. But then if you think about writers who are dissident writers in their own country, or writers who are writing from being in prison, or writers in exile, so who are writing in a language but not necessarily in the cultural context that language comes from, or they're negotiating a new cultural context for themselves, or writers on the move. We've got a massive refugee crisis, and there are artists who are literally moving from place to place. And those perspectives are really important as well to be part of the conversation we're having about what the world looks like and how it could look like. And so I think translators, we're moving away from translators being kind of invisible agents within an industry to being actually, as individuals, going out making relationships with writers whose very particular messages should be heard. And I think that's a kind of new stage of activity for translators, and it's really exciting to see that.
Is there a concomitant risk in that scenario where the translators become as vulnerable, if not more so, than the writers, potentially? Is that emerging through the PEN network at the minute?
Well, at the moment, we work a lot with translators, but we don't kind of have a formal network of translator activists. That's actually something that we're thinking of establishing in the coming few years, setting up a sort of toolbox of resources for translators who want to do activism work in that kind of direct action way, and a network to communicate with each other. So that's in early stages, but yeah, I mean, certainly when a translator steps into that position of personally directly representing a writer, that comes with risks.
Yeah, I think I ask because I sit on the board of the International Cities of Refuge Network, and there are 46 cities around Europe and North America and South America now who each host writers and artists in residence who are at risk due to freedom of expression threats against them, whether that's economic or artistic. And we're noticing an increase in translators applying to that network, partly because translation it's almost a social media of its own of its own right within contested territories, and in difficult political situations it becomes a very, very political act. How have you seen that working in your work and the actual direct political engagement of translation and literature, Kadija? Has there been a cultural shift in your years of working in the sector?
I think, some of the things I noticed, like when I work in the Gambia a lot, is that young people are using it to challenge. Well, no, I think they always have, but before it happened more on stage, I think. Mm-hmm. On stage and on poetry, that they're using it to challenge the political situation in the country, knowing that they are pushing boundaries. They are really pushing boundaries, and knowing that they can get themselves into problems. And sometimes they will just, if things get really tight, they will move temporarily across the borders to another country. But they're not letting the political situation stop them from doing what they think needs to be done. So I mean, it politically it is. So the only way I think it has changed from what I've seen is that younger people are engaging with it more, and they're willing to take the risks with that more.
And is that because the access to the medium, the social media technologies, is less? There are fewer barriers than in traditional publishing.
I think that's one of it. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons. And not only that, the whole world is opening up to them in terms of they can see what's happening in other countries, which is sometimes a good thing, sometimes not a good thing, because then they feel that, okay, in terms of going the back way, getting out of the country, they feel they can do that and not realizing they can risk their lives doing that, which is really sad. But so I'm seeing younger people doing that.
And Erica, on that same point, are you noticing within PEN a change in what is being published and what's actually making it through to the formal channels of publication in translation? Are there more directly political, more challenging books being translated? I'm thinking of Deborah Smith's work on Han Kang, as well as some of the work coming out of Germany and the former Soviet republics in recent years.
I'm not sure I'd say that the UK publishing industry has consciously chosen to publish a new kind of work, but it's the kind of change that happens slowly. When you get used to seeing writers from other languages, international writers, on the event circuit or winning prize, there's lots of cultural things that have happened to make it to bring international voices sort of into the mainstream more. And in a completely non-political way, but just doing that makes it more normal to see those voices and those faces there, and then you begin to get the cutting-edge writers coming in. It happens over time. I think inevitably publishers will want to acquire books that they think their readers will want to read, and that is sometimes to do with a curiosity about other places. Sometimes it's about the politics. There's a lot of interest in writing from the Middle East at the moment, and quite understandably. This year, I'm already aware of 4 or 5 books that directly address the refugee crisis, and some of those are in translation. So it's a response to the world out there as well. I wanted to just touch on something about the translators here. Getting recognition and being named on books, being awarded prizes equally with writers, things like that. That sort of increase of profile for them has actually also allowed translators to do things like commentate on political issues. So most of my friends aren't in literature and they don't know anything about translation, but most of them read Alice Guthrie's piece on what Daesh means. And I don't know if it was originally published on the Free Word blog, but then it went everywhere, and she's a translator from the Arabic and an activist as well, but writing about literally what the word Daesh means and what the significance of using that term for ISIS or IS signifies. And as a translator, she's really exactly the best person to make that kind of commentary, and the fact that translators are now taken more seriously as writers and seen within the industry more actually allows them to occupy that space as well.
So there's a growing role for the translator as public intellectual, in fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And have you kind of noticed that in your campaigning and your kind of, I was going to say proselytizing work, but I mean popularizing work in terms of the cultures and languages that you've been working with? Are there people that have actually championed, or translators that have championed the work that have really changed the game for literature?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o is definitely one of them, and he's seen as somebody who a lot of other translators and even young people will look up to, and I'm glad he's one of the things he is part of his legacy I'm seeing is encouraging younger people to do that. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do with Inscribe at People Tree, is that we had a couple of young Somali writers, and I said, well, okay, since this established poet in your community has got some new work to be translated, why don't we work with you to help you do that? So we're trying to do things like that in terms of not just using the well-known figure, because we've kind of got to get away from this thing, not just with translation, with everything, that, okay, so if you've got one, we've got the one, so you having that one person, is represents everybody else. So if we've got one Ngugi, we can't have anybody else, and that's not the case. We can have many Ngugis. Yeah. So what I want to try and do is encourage many Ngugis in all genders, male and female genders. Yeah.
It takes me on to a really interesting question about translation, or literary translation, and education. I'm wondering, could you perhaps both say something about the roles that PEN and your own different organisations, how you use literary translation in community and engagement programmes, and is that something which it feels to me from where I sit to be developing quite quickly in a really exciting area, but I just wondered from your perspective what work you're doing with literary translation in your education work.
I I've done a bit even in schools, even from primary schools, and just especially when you're in areas where there are children and you've got about 30 languages in one room, and encourage them to tell the stories in their own language. It really, it really gives the children confidence, and they just exchange a lot of work and stories in different languages. And also, I did some work with some schools in Eastbourne, and I met somebody there she is on the committee for the Stephen Spender Trust, which I hadn't heard about. And they have a poetry translators in schools program, and they had used like a South African poet and doing praise poetry in schools. I think that must be really exciting, And I always think, wish I could have had that, So it's really good that they're not just thinking, okay, translation into different languages has to be like just for adults. You start it from young, and that's great, so that the children themselves are understanding each other's cultures through languages and also respecting them as well. That can happen almost organically. It's not like something you're forcing, like you're doing it this language, you're doing it this language, and forcing things together. It's just like a natural happening, and that's what I think needs to be encouraged. And it's good however that can be done.
Erica.
Yeah, I think that's right. When we're talking about translation in this kind of setting, we often do, give it that kind of language. Oh, it's cultural good and it's a cultural exchange and blah blah. For a lot of young people, especially in this country, having more than one language is just a reality of survival. Young people translate on behalf of their parents just to get on with everyday life, but maybe they're not so used to thinking about it as being a kind of creative power. And English Pen, as I was mentioning, has the Readers and Writers program. I just want to point out my colleague Louise Swan there and Becca Morell, who run that program, so you can ask them all about it afterwards. Working with different groups in the UK who are multilingual, and making use of creative translation workshops to kind of bring out the ideas in that, whether it's right at the beginning of feeling like you are able to tell your story in your own voice. That's already very powerful. Through to playing with what language does, what's embedded in working with words between languages. What kind of other ideas can you uncover by doing that, and how can you contribute to the literary culture that you're in? We were having this discussion yesterday about L2 translation, and Tuesday Banbury, who's down there, was talking about if you're bilingual, you feel at home in translation. That conversation between cultures and languages is natural to you, and so, like Kadija was saying, working with young people who have that already in their lives to explore the creative potential of that is really powerful. So that's something that we do.
So can I just mention, give myself a plug on my app? It's called the Modern Pan-Africanist Journey. One of the things that we want to do, we will eventually have about 100 poets on there, and some of it will be young people. So this is not all of my ideas. Sometimes this is other people giving me ideas to do it. But also some of the work will be there with African poets. African poets in translation as well, so that there will be a poem, there'll be a performance, and a little bit of a bio, so that work as well can be shared. So it's not just the older and dead Pan-Africanists, or not just men. At the moment, the youngest one there is about 24 or something. So that, young people, so that anybody who wants to learn about either Pan-Africanism or look at some of the poetry that African people are doing, can see it in different languages and different formats. And it's just maybe more as a resource, just almost like a taster, really. And as well, I thought the performance aspect was really important, the video, so that people can see the poet in action. So I'm hoping then we can do a little bit more of that in a couple of different languages as well, because that's what Pan-Africanism is about as well. So it's good.
It brings me to, if I can, before we sort of start opening the floor up and asking for your questions and thoughts, can I just ask, I'm really fascinated, Erica, about the notion of a toolkit for translators as activists. I mean, we can ask the audience what might be in that toolkit as well, apart from sort of a packet of coffee and some strong painkillers. What might be in that toolkit, do you think? Or should we just go and ask people in the audience what we should start putting in the toolkit?
Well, no, I haven't got a fixed idea of what's going to be in it yet. We originally thought of it as being an online resource, the kind of things about safety and legal information that translators might need to know about when they're operating in different situations, but also if it's what translators would like, a way to be in contact with each other in a safe way, maybe a place to gather to discuss things or share ways to share information. I really hope that there's translator activists here who we can talk to begin to put that together, because I think it's kind of a formalizing of how PEN has already worked with translators over the years, and I think it would be a really valuable thing. So ideas, please.
Yeah, it sounds like a good place to start. I think, do we have a handheld microphone as well that we can use? Brilliant. Are there any translators who would like to belong to a translator activist network? If so, what should be in the network pack as a starter for 10? Anyone, any thoughts? Nobody's got any thoughts at all. Yes, there are. There's some thinking going on right over there. Fighting the way through with a microphone for you.
Thank you. I wanted to thank you for this, and also to, in a way, to remember that translator activism has been going on for centuries. I mean, if I think of myself as a young translator in my teens in Italy, there was one translator in particular there who went into post-McCarthy America to interview blacklisted authors to bring them back to us in Italy. There was the Fernanda Pivano. Then there was Joyce Lusso, who actually made it her life's work to actually travel to war-torn zones and interview and translate poets in jail. She wrote a wonderful book about that called Portrait, which in fact ought to be translated. One thing that I was thinking of, I know that PEN has a lot of wonderful things going on for translation. One, for instance, the funding for translation samples is very good, but if we could have more possibility for the translator to have even less filtering in accessing resources and funding, because often it is very difficult to begin with to convince a publisher that you have maybe 5, 6, 7 poets or writers that ought to be heard here, and then the publisher may or may not decide to make an application for PEN. So that stymies discourse in a very heavy way for people who actively want to get that going. But having said that, it is a wonderful set of resources we've already got.
Christina, do you mean funding to produce the translations?
To produce the translations, possibly even to travel to places that are areas where the source texts are being written and so on. And one thing that it is good, as you say, that we are formalizing what already happens, but there might be a risk to translation as writing happens the most unpredictable and different and difficult setup. So if we say these are the guidelines and then stick to them too rigidly, we risk. It's difficult, obviously, because we should have resources, and those are not put in place without a structure. But it should be quite a flexible one. Having said that, I have nothing to add, but thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question just over this end here. You can see.
I was just going to add to the toolkit.
Yes, do, please.
I work in a small collective of Chinese to English translators. There are 4 of us, all working as volunteers. And I think crucial is inexhaustible energy.
Yeah, I'm sure we can get that on the internet. Yep.
And making connections with as many other like-minded organizations as you can. Don't try and do it on your own. And just go for it. I mean, we have a short story series where we publish a short story every week for a year, and we've done a number of events to publicize that. And people from other languages have said to me, oh, if only we had that. But the thing is, we didn't have that a year ago. We did it ourselves. I just wouldn't recommend trying to do it on your own. But I think people forming themselves into small groups, using social media, and just putting themselves out there.
Can you tell us a little bit about the magazine and the publishing schedule that you have?
Yes, we had the website. It wasn't terribly active. It was mainly a blog site. It's called paperrepublic.org. It started off as a blog site and a site with resources for translators. However, we then decided that we wanted to make Chinese fiction in translation popular, and so we came up with this idea of a complete short story free to view online every Thursday for a year. We basically decided the year because we thought we might have run out of energy after a year. But, you know, we're almost at the end of the year and we have plans for the future, so it probably has now acquired a momentum of its own. But then having put a short story up every week, that was really easy because translators were really generous in giving us their short stories. Then the key thing was to tell people that the short stories were there. So we've organised a number of live events. We do quite a lot of blogging. We co-publish with other websites. We time our short stories to something that's in the news, like a disappearance of Hong Kong publishers. We published a story about disappearances, and so on and so forth. And it can feel a bit haphazard, but we've made it work. And we're not all geniuses, and sometimes one of us gets really tired and drops out for a couple of weeks. But I think having 3 or 4 people, you can make it work, and you can gradually make quite a big difference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think if people have further suggestions for the toolbox, that's great. If you just have general questions, that's also fine as well, because we have about 10 minutes left. So there's a microphone coming towards you.
My question is a bit between both, really, because I was, really applaud what you're saying about the translator as a writer. I completely agree with that. Yet, at the moment, we're in quite a grey area there, because some people may see translators as writers, other people don't. And it's not always clear, if you just say, we want writers to do this, for example, that you might want to include translators in that as well. And maybe we are quite shrinking violets in many ways, and we would tend to think, oh, that's not for me. If it says writer, it's not for me. And I think that goes into the activism as well, because you may sort of sit back and think, oh, well, it's nothing to do with me. They want writers on this. So maybe it's still, we're at a stage where we need to make it clear to translators that translators
So we
are
need to
included.
translate that translation term. Because for me, I always saw a translator as a writer. So if there's translators who didn't see themselves as writers, I just think that was a bit strange. Because, right, yeah, okay. That's a good point.
Very quickly, sorry. It helps sometimes if you meet the attitude to answer and say, I'm just writing this translation and...
Thank you. Do we have any other thoughts either? Oh, yes, we do. Sorry.
Sorry.
Hi. Well, it's a question, really, and it's... it's an open question. It might sound like it's not, but it is an open question. I was thinking about some sort of concept of duty of care. I work in theatre. I translate from Spanish, and I recently translated a play written by a Cuban playwright, which had been commissioned by a theatre here in London as part of a project called World Stages, which was a project where various theatres across the country were given small pots of money to invite theatre makers over from countries where there was censorship to either write or produce theatre or work on theatre projects. And I was talking to the writer about his play, and he said that the play which this theatre had commissioned, he wasn't quite sure if he would feel that it would be all right for that play to be actually produced in Cuba. He thought that he might get into some kind of trouble. Whereas here he was in London writing sort of more freely. And I suppose I wondered what you thought maybe the ethical / duty of care concerns might be, or if you've come across them in terms of working within the UK, where we have the luxury of freedom of speech, with writers in territories where maybe they don't, who know that their work may be translated into English, and whether or not there's any sort of, I don't know if I'm making any sense with that question, about sort of whether or not as translators we have any duty of care towards inadvertently influencing what people write. Does that make it? It's an open question anyway.
Yeah.
I think it does make sense. Yes, Erica, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really efficiently asked question, which is actually really complicated, because we're talking about different literary spheres, but in a world that is very connected. So there isn't such a thing as, a different literary context in the UK and Cuba, and they're not all sort of little bubbles. They do affect each other, and writers who are banned in one place but celebrated elsewhere, that does sort of change what happens in literature. But I would say that translators do, I think they take very seriously how they represent their writers and what they help to share. But it's not just translators working alone. The people who commission that play, the programmers, the people who sort of set the cultural agenda are also part of that story. And it's about kind of whether you take the originating literary context as the sort of primary one, you sort of accept the primacy of that, or whether you're talking about the writer and their work themselves, and it's incidental that they're in a country where that piece of work wouldn't be accepted. You know what I mean? There's sort of history as part of that as well. So I don't think there's one answer to that, but I think these are the kind of issues that translators do take very seriously.
Perhaps if we can just get the microphone to Joe from PEN, and then I'll come back to you,
Joe,
Kadija.
who's the director of English PEN.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that, because I think it's a really key question, and in fact something that Erica mentioned at the start regarding this piece of this report by a Turkish writer that we published that was translated from Turkish. And we had very similar concerns there, because he wrote it in Turkish, we translated it into English. It was not going to be published in Turkey, but it would obviously be widely read in Turkey. And so therefore there was, the risk to him here was minimal, but the risk in Turkey was great. So we had many, many discussions. And ultimately I think it has that the publisher or the theatre company certainly has a great responsibility, I think, to discuss the risks, and that then it comes down to, in the end, the consent of the writer, and is the writer aware of all the risks, and is the publisher, translator, whoever has the responsibility for putting that work out there, the theatre company, what will they, I think it all has to be thought through. I think it's a very serious question.
Kadija.
Yeah, I think that is a good question on another level when we were talking about translating in terms of culture, because even if it wasn't a language translation, it's cultural. It's kind of like, well, okay, we can deal with this here, but if they did that at home, they're going to be something that will happen just in terms of what they're talking about. And I know it happened to a friend of mine, Sefriata, in terms of she didn't realize really in terms of, okay, I write about these relationships in America, going to Nigeria, they're like, what are you talking about? That doesn't happen. And of course it did, but they didn't want to see that, And so there's that whole translation thing in terms of culture. And at the end of the day, like you say, it is up to the writer. So I think the care is just to be supportive, that if they want to do that and choose to do that, that as the carer, whoever it is supportive. And to say, we will support whatever your decision is to do that. I think that's all we can do. Otherwise, then we're doing the censoring as well.
If I could just finally add, from the Cities of Refuge Network point of view, when we're requested to translate and publish a piece of work from one of the resident writers, we always consider whether that writer is planning to go back to their country of origin, whether they're writing from there or not, or whether they're writing from a third country, and whether anonymity would either help them in terms of protecting their reputation back in their home country, or whether that would reduce the impact of the work which they want to maximise. It ends up being an intensely personal set of conversations that you have to have, which covers everything from family safety through to professional and financial benefit from the work that's happening itself. So it's never a one-size-fits-all conversation, I think, is the message coming out.
So the Toolkit is going to be very flexible.
Yes, indeed. We've got time for two more short points. I don't know if anyone has anything to raise, or anyone would just like to add a final suggestion for the Toolkit that doesn't involve illegal drugs. No? In which case, I would like to thank Kadija, George, and Erica Jarnes for their presence here. Thank you for coming this morning,
Thank
and
you.
we're here to talk afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much.